I was impressed that Bennett was there reading that whole passage from his small screen on his phone, and it reminds me when I had to get a new phone a couple of weeks ago, my friend was like, "You sure you don't need a bigger one? I mean, after all, you're getting to that age." Oh, please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, I'm someone who enjoys poetry. It's always nice to have a chance to take one of the volumes off my shelf and flip through and see some poems that are new to me or ones that I've read before. And one of my favorites is this poem, Sometimes. Sometimes things don't go, after all, from bad to worse. Some years, muscadel faces down the frost. Green thrives, crops don't fail. Sometimes a man aims high and all goes well. A people sometimes will step back from war, elect an honest man, decide they care enough that they can't leave some stranger poor. Some men become what they were born for. Sometimes our best intentions do not go amiss. Sometimes we do as we meant to. The sun will sometimes melt a field of sorrow that seemed hard frozen. May it happen for you. It's always nice to be reminded that sometimes things do go well. It's nice to think about those moments of grace that come into your lives and sometimes change them. All of us have had experiences where some particular moment, some chance encounter, if you will, changed our lives for the better. I think about when I was in high school. I had a very hard time early in high school finding friends. And I've shared this story before, but it's one that's meaningful to me. I had a hard time finding friends. I would reach out and try and make plans, and always these other classmates had things going on. I guess I was just too much of a dork, or I guess that hasn't changed. But sophomore year in high school, after lacrosse practice one day, I'll never forget, Matt Grabler, one of my friends, now friends, came over to me and asked me, he's like, "Hey, what are you doing on Saturday night? Do you want to come over and play poker with us?" It's the first time that anyone had ever asked me to do something socially from 7th grade to 10th grade. It was a bit of grace that came into my life. I became good friends with all these people. I am still close friends to these folks to this day. One moment, a moment of grace, someone reaching out. A few years ago, I was reading a book that was on my dad's shelf. He always loved history, and particularly business history or war history. I remember reading this book by Ron Chernow called The House of Morgan. And as I was reading it through, one of the stories that Chernow tells is the story of Tom Lamont, who in the early part of the 20th century, Tom Lamont was the most famous and most influential financier in the world. He was the Jamie Dimon of his era. And Tom Lamont was not originally a financier. He was working in some merchant goods store in New York, and he was on a train one day going from New Jersey to New York, and it just so happened he was sitting next to someone who was a partner at JP Morgan. And they had the whole train ride to talk, and by the end of the train ride, this partner at JP Morgan said, "You're in the wrong business. You got to come work for me." A chance encounter, a bit of grace, changed his life. What about the time when you met the person you fell in love with? What was that circumstance? Think of that bit of grace that came into your life. I love the story of how my parents met. My mother, back in the early 70s, was a part of the junior league in Boston. And there was a junior league cocktail party that my dad very reluctantly was invited to. And since he didn't really want to go to this junior league cocktail party, he ended up delaying as long as he could and then showed up right at the end. And he looked around and he was like, "Okay, who seems like an interesting person to talk to?" And there was this one woman in the corner surrounded by 3 guys engaged in conversation, and my dad was like, "That's the woman I want to talk to." Now, my dad was a charming guy. He goes over, strikes up a conversation, and of course, this cocktail party is winding down. So my father, it's probably around 9 o'clock at night, says to my mother, "Hey, do you want to go play tennis?" And she's like, "Sure, when?" And he's like, "What about now?" And my mother, always being up for an adventure, says, sure, let's do it. I'm curious what this guy has going on. So my dad took my mom around the corner to some bar that had one of those early arcade games that was a tennis game. And that's how they met. A bit of grace coming into your life. And those bits of grace are not just life-changing moments. They can be moments that happen to you in the daily going about your work. It could be something great that you're in a hurry and you actually have the good fortune of that good parking spot that's right in front of where you need to be. It could be someone being really nice to you out of the blue, helping you to maybe put your groceries in your car or offering you just a bit of help when you needed it. These bits of grace are everywhere in our lives, but the problem is so often we have a difficulty remembering that. Instead, we remember all the bad things. We tend to get caught in those cycles of, all the bad stuff that happens to our lives, and we forget that God's grace just infuses everything. And one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves about how we live a great life is, how do we hold on to those moments of grace? How do we remind ourselves of them? That life actually is full of so many blessings. Our text for this morning that Bennett just read is the final of the resurrection appearances in the Gospel of John. And this passage I love because it's actually full of humor in various ways. Here you have Peter saying to these 6 other disciples he's hanging out with, he's like, hey, guys, do you want to go fishing? Now, again, this strikes me as partly amusing because according to the gospel accounts, they're supposed to be fishermen, after all. But it's said as more like they're on the weekends, and Peter's like, hey, dudes, you want to go fishing? And they're like, sure. So they fish all night long, and they catch nothing. And so there they are, not very happy at the end of the day. And there's this rando guy on the shore that they don't recognize, who then, his phraseology to them is like, hey, kids, have any luck yet? Now, these are grown men, and Jesus is referring to them as children. Hey, kids, you have any luck yet? They're like, no. He's like, why don't you try the other side of the boat? As though they hadn't tried that side of the boat, fishing all night long. So they toss their nets over the right side of the boat, and all of a sudden, there's this miraculous haul of fish, 153 fish that they draw in. A bit of grace that comes into their life unexpectedly after a night of working. And it's only after that grace comes into their lives that the beloved disciple, the disciple whom Jesus loved, looks to the shore and says, hey, that's JC. And then Peter, Peter now is totally naked, according to the text, which seems to be an odd detail. I didn't know that fishermen spent all night fishing naked. And then another funny detail, he's like, I'm going to go swim to him, but let me put my clothes on to swim. I'm like, so Peter then swims to shore, and the other disciples come and they bring the fish. And what do? They share a meal right there on the beach. The fish are cooked. Jesus brought along a whole bunch of bread, and they share a meal. And I think about, in my own life, how there's probably no place in my life that I've had more fun, felt more connection, and felt more grace than around a table. Now, I also happen to be someone who loves hosting people around my table, but I'm sure you've had similar experiences. I think back 20 years ago, I had the great privilege of studying Latin in Rome with this crazy discalced Carmelite named Reggie Foster. And we had our Latin courses in the morning, which was all in spoken Latin, which was quite an intense experience. And then the afternoons we had free to do our homework and also to hang out. And I remember setting up with some of the folks that were there a regular Wednesday night supper, where I invited them out to the place where I was cat sitting for a random lady that I had met 3 weeks ago that for some reason trusted me to cat sit for her small apartment in Rome. And her cats were 18 years old, and I was constantly petrified they would die. They did not. And we would have these amazing Wednesday night suppers where we just had the most fun and felt this deep connection, and it just made the whole experience so rich. Coming out of the pandemic in Houston after all the separation in 2021, I got to a point where I was tired of going out in Montrose to the bars or whatever. I wanted to have people together, so I went out, and being the cheap person I was, I bought the cheapest grill I could find, which was this old Weber charcoal grill, you know the type. And I got my charcoal, and I would just, every Sunday, because that's my night off, every Sunday I would invite whoever was around to come over for a barbecue. I'd buy some potatoes and make my potato salad and throw together whatever else I could and throw a whole bunch of stuff on the grill and just open invitation to whoever was around. And each week it was a different group of people all through the summer that would come by the house. And after the isolation of the pandemic, to feel that connection and to see who would show up. And there was always more meat that I could find to throw on the grill. It was easy to add one more. But how much grace, how much connection in those meals. Scholars say that this breakfast on the beach that Jesus has with bread and fish is an example of an early communion supper. Here is bread and fish, and some scholars say that early communion was likely with bread and fish, not just bread and wine. Fish, of course, within the Christian tradition has a lot of symbolism. Not only were the disciples fishermen, but also fish in Greek, ichthus, is an acrostic for Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. That's why people have those little fish symbols on the back of their car, you know, the ichthus. So this was an early communion celebration. That in the face of this incredible grace where God comes into their lives, Jesus' response is, let's share a meal. And in that meal, that's where God becomes present. It reinforces the fact of God being in our lives. This is what we do around our communion table. One thing we do in communion, of course, is we celebrate the communion of all of us together. And today we'll serve it in the traditional congregational sense, where you can imagine us there on that beach, all surrounded by this fire, with Jesus himself as the host, sharing, and you can feel that spiritual communion as we take this sacrament. But the sacrament is more than that, too. One of the words for the sacrament is Eucharist, which literally means thanksgiving. A part of the communion liturgy every single time we celebrate it is what's known as either the Eucharistic prayer or the Great Thanksgiving. And that Eucharistic prayer is an opportunity for us to name all of those incidences in our lives where grace came into our life. And to thank God for it. To remember each of those incidences. This past week, things in your life that might have helped change your life and put it in a new direction. This is why church services and something like communion matter so much. In the midst of all the grace that happens that we tend to forget and tend to ignore, this is an opportunity to come here and try and incorporate it into our view of the world, to reframe the negativity of the world, not from some of the stuff you might have seen on your phones this morning, but instead what you meet around this table, God's grace. And as you remember those incidences. And I love where the story goes from this. After there's this gracious moment, there's this celebration of this gracious moment where Jesus' presence is there as they share this meal. And the very next thing Jesus says to Peter is, do you love me more than these? As in, do you love me more than these things of the world? And then he says, feed my sheep. And there's this interesting parallel. I don't know if you caught this. Just as Peter denies Jesus 3 times, there's this threefold around a fire. There's now a new fire where here Jesus says, feed my sheep, tend my lambs, feed my sheep. A threefold reaffirmation of what he's supposed to do. Because once we can see the grace in our lives and see how richly it's there, around a table, this table or one in your homes, once we can remember that and think of those times, we're uplifted such that then we can go serve others. We serve others out of that sense of God's grace and goodness, and we can bring that to other people. And I rejoice every time this congregation does that. I celebrate that, Gary and Chris and Nana went to Common Cathedral on Easter of all days. They went after service on Easter to go bring food and also share communion with the homeless people gathered there on Boston Common, literally feeding my sheep. The day before, Sally took a group of people to Cradles to Crayons in Needham, where packages were put together for kids in need. And then the very next day, I was on this kind of wild service trip, an epic 18-hour drive down to Appalachia, where we had the chance to help these folks there and then try and journal and incorporate it into God's presence in our lives. Last Sunday, we had the privilege of hearing after church about some of the mental health concerns in our community. Today after church, we get to hear from my friend Avik Chatterjee talk about Boston Healthcare for the Homeless, for which we collected money for our Easter offering. Feed my sheep, tend my lambs, feed my sheep. We're fed here, reminded of God's grace, and then bring it out into the world in big and small ways. One of my favorite movies from back in the day is a 1950s classic, Auntie Mame. I'm sure many of you have seen it, right? Rosalind Russell as the lead role. And one of the great lines in Auntie Mame, I love this line, is, "Life is a banquet, and most poor suckers are starving." Life is a banquet. We celebrate the banquet of life around this table. As Christians, we could celebrate the banquet of life that comes into your own lives in so many ways, big and small. Lifted up by that. Then we get to go out and feed Jesus' sheep. So let us go and do likewise.